Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature. Welcome back, Phil.
It's good to be back. We prepped several PDFs for this, but we have chosen a very good one.
I was wondering when this was going to come up. You're going to start with it.
Start with it right away.
Phil has been so incredibly flexible with me. As if listeners remember, this is going to be especially jarring for those people who are not listening in real time, who just heard us say we were going to cover On Stories by C.S. Lewis next, and then that's not what we're doing today. Maybe not even ever. Who knows? That was a little strong, but we're not covering that today. Instead, I made a change on Phil less than, about 3 hours ago?
Right.
Where I was like, what if we do something different for tonight? And there's
Imagine reading East of Eden and then coming to class to discuss East of Eden. And for the first time in your life, you're really prepared ahead of time. And then the teacher says, actually, it's much shorter to do F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Or just of Mice and Men, same author, right?
Yeah. What if we did Mice and Men instead? Here's
like,
a PDF.
I'm prepared.
Just read through that real quick, and then we'll talk about it publicly for an hour.
On Stories, as I was reading through it, I read through it multiple times the last few weeks. You prepared for it today.
No.
Yesterday.
I prepared for it yesterday, and then I fell asleep, and then I prepared the rest of it today. And
as I was preparing for it, doing a little bit of research, I came across two other essays that were unknown to me until today. I had not even heard of these essays before. They're both in the same book that On Stories is in, a book very aptly titled On Stories, which is a collection that Walter Hooper did. I think it came out maybe in the 60s. And two other essays in there. One was called Different Tastes in Literature, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And then we might bring up this other book this other short essay. It's like a page and a half called On Juvenile Tastes. And both of these came up in my research, and I was so moved by them, so taken aback that I was like, you know what? I would really rather talk about these. And I did give you the option. I did not say, hey, Phil, forget that. Yes. I just said, hey, do you want to do On Stories, or how would you feel if we covered something different? And I was like, if we do On Stories, that's great. And you're like, no, I'm happy to be flexible.
All I'm saying is, if people want to truly prepare for this episode, you need to read On Stories and then throw it away. And then read Different Tastes in Literature, and then consider throwing it away in order to read On Juvenile Tastes.
Yeah, both of these, I had not read through all of On Stories. I have I actually just purchased it on Kindle today, which I think you said you also had done a similar thing.
It was on sale.
I did not have a paperback copy of it because a bunch of the other essays in it I have in other collections, like his review of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are in there, but I have them in a different work called like Imagination, and so, I don't know, and like it's something not published by HarperCollins. It's published by like one of the more academic-y publishers. So I hadn't picked up this copy because there's only about 2 or 3 essays, maybe about 4 or 5 essays in here that I didn't already have, and 2 of them happen to be these 2 essays that I'm really excited to chat a little bit about today. And they were both short. I read them so quickly. I was like, wow, this is so good.
Yeah,
and
they
really
are good. And that's why we're doing this.
And really in line with what we've been doing. And we've said before, we don't want to have this is a shorter season, so I didn't want to tack on an extra episode or 2 to the end of this season, but instead I said, let's maybe wait on Stories. We can still come back to that in the future, but Different Tastes in Literature, which will take up most of our time today, and then On Juvenile Tastes, both just feel like they are a part of a conversation that you and I have been trying to have throughout this season, and that we've been inviting our listeners into. It just felt like we had to cover them right now because they fit exactly in the moment that we are in.
Yeah, definitely. Can you give me any context to where Different Tastes in Literature was published?
Yeah. They, I don't have a ton. I literally only have Walter Hooper's words that come in the preface to this book. In fact, I searched around for information about Different Tastes in Literature and On Juvenile Tastes, and mostly, I'm not joking, mostly Reddit posts and blog posts. Like, not a lot of, like, actually long-form criticism of them or investigation of their claims.
I was hoping for more, but all I found was blog
it was mostly
from
just like
2012.
random blog posts and then Reddit posts. I found some Reddit posts of people saying, "Has anyone read this?" And then people being like, "No." There's literally a Reddit post.
Why comment on it?
Yeah, like, why do that? But Walter Hooper says this about Different Tastes of Literature. He says it's a title that he gave to this collection of 2 essays that appeared in something called it appeared in Time and Tide on May the 25th, 1946, and then a week later on June the 1st, 1946. It was something Lewis had called Notes on the Way, but it's given a new name, Different Tastes in Literature by Walter Hooper. So that's 1946 in 2 parts. And if you were to read this essay, if you were to find it, it does have kind of a break right in the middle. And I believe Lewis even says something along the lines of...
Until next week. I'll discuss this next week.
Yeah,
and then
I'll say this
last week.
And then he begins with, I was saying last week. So it's pretty obvious what's happening there. And then On Juvenile Tastes is reprinted from the Church Times, which is a children's book supplement that was released on November the 28th, 1958, just was that 5 years and a day before Lewis's death. So interesting that for our context as people who've been focusing so much on the Narnia books, Different Taste in Literature is written before he has finished any of the Narnia books, and On Juvenile Taste is published after all of the books themselves have been released. So interesting that we're getting both kind of before Narnia and after Narnia.
Now, there's also one. So, say the dates for On Stories. So that was in 49.
On Stories, though, is in the midst of him writing Wardrobe, because I think you're right, that it was released in 49. If you give me a quick second, I can pull it up here.
The reason I ask is he mentions If We Ever Do Go to the Moon. And it's very, very...
47.
47, okay. It's very interesting to read that, knowing that we did go to the moon, allegedly.
They can't prove it.
In 1969. And that was the main thing I was excited to talk about for that one. So you'll have to wait.
Well, the other things that are so interesting about On Stories, and why, as I was preparing the last 3 weeks with this essay, I just kept going deeper and deeper into this essay, the one On Stories. Not the book On Stories, which is where all 3 of these essays are found, but the essay On Stories, which is what the book is named after. It was released in a book presented after the death of Charles Williams, and actually includes Tolkien's On Fairy Stories in it, too, which is interesting. Huh. But it's an essay that Lewis had been working on for almost 10 years. Did you do any of this in your research on Stories?
No.
So it was something where he'd been working on it since the late 30s, had first presented the paper in, I believe, 1940. And a big part of the paper was about what he called the kappa element in romance, or the kappa element in story, with a capital S, story, and where he talks about kappa in the Greek sense, meaning the hidden element in stories. And he presents that in 1940, and the reason why I kept just going deeper into this rabbit hole is because by the time the actual essay is released to the public, not just presented to a short group of people, but actually presented, in a book, essays presented to Charles Williams in 1947, he actually has completely taken out any reference to the kappa element. So what the essay once was completely shifts in 7 years or so. And the more I kept reading, this is really interesting what's going on. I mean, and a lot of it is way over my head. Like, I was really wading through. I'm excited to still get there one day, hopefully. But so much was going on with it. I just thought this was so interesting because there's so much history around On Stories, and then these other 2 essays have almost no history to them.
Right. Not as much critique, not as much public consumption.
No, and so I thought, you know what? Let's go ahead. Let's bring these 2 smaller essays to our listeners today and go through them. By the way, I'll also just mention the book On Stories. If listeners are going to pick up one particular book during this season, to just read with us or to go back over, this one has almost all the essays we've covered. Obviously, it has on juvenile tastes and on different tastes in literature that we'll chat about today. It has on stories. It has on 3 ways of writing for children. It has sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said. I mean, this thing has some great stuff. It has his review of The Lord of the Rings, his review of The Hobbit. It's got on science fiction. I don't know if you've read that one yet.
No.
That's one worth reading.
I'm glad I have a copy.
Yeah, we're not going to cover it on this show, but really worth reading. Another interesting one is George Orwell, which is just the name of the essay. The name of the essay is George Orwell. There is an essay in here on George Orwell, and it was written in 1955. So very interesting. Lewis wrote about Mr. George Orwell here.
That's right after Big Brother 1984 came out?
No, definitely after 1984 is, I want to say, late 40s.
Okay.
And so he's writing this, I believe that's just said 55. I believe it starts, let me pull it up. He even says, the very beginning is, now that the rumpus about the performance of Orwell's 1984 on television is dying down, it may be opportune to raise a question which has exercised my mind for a considerable time. Why is that, even before the recent spate of publicity, I met 10 people who knew 1984 for one who knew Animal Farm? And so he talks a lot about Animal Farm versus 1984. We've mentioned before that Orwell really loved That Hideous Strength by Lewis and said it was a big influence on him. Lewis had interesting opinions on Orwell and his writing, and so reading that essay, which I started to read today, it's very short. I literally only read like a page, though, because I was like, no, I got to not be distracted. But he writes about 1984, which is interesting.
Huh. And you were right. 1949 is when it came out.
It is. Okay.
Well, this is a really great essay, so let's dive in.
Yeah, so different tastes in literature. How would you describe this, Phil? What is this essay about?
If we had to boil it down, which we do, it's part of our job, I think it comes down to we have 2 types of things you can read. There's the stuff that you might, quote, enjoy, but there's another type of stuff that hits a little deeper that you keep coming back to.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he is outright saying you shouldn't read any of the other stuff. He's just saying there is something deeper and more meaningful and more impactful. And I think what it comes down to is, are you going to want to go back and read it again? For example, there are certain popular published names that I have read. I've read a couple James Patterson novels, and it is fun to read through them, but it feels like a sugar high, and then it's over. And something like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, I really want to go back and reread it.
Sure.
Steinbeck's East of Eden, I want to go back and be immersed in that novel again, and I know there's so much more in there. Mm-hmm. And there are other things that might at first glance seem like it's a cheaper form of entertainment. Watchmen is a great example. There is so much in that comic that it, to me, transcends the usual comic book fare, even though it was published in a serial format.
Yeah, so this is interesting. You're right. There's different kind of levels. There's a hierarchy, absolutely. In fact, I might go ahead and read the first paragraph here, because I think it gives you, it kind of lays the foundation here. So here's what Lewis says in the very first paragraph. I have been thinking once again about the troublesome problem of differences in what is called taste, which he capitalizes. Though the implications of the word taste, if taken seriously, would leave us with no problem. If we really thought that a man's choice between Miss Ruby M. Ayers, who was, just as an aside, a romance novelist at that time. I was not familiar with her. I don't know if you were.
Well, that's also what's interesting about reading this now is some of these names have not stayed around.
Exactly. That's what I thought was so funny is I'll just pause for a minute to say, multiple times I was reading this, I was chatting about it with Anna, and I was asking her, "Have you know any of these people?" And she's very well read. She's like, "Never heard of any of them." And I was like, "That's so funny that." And then the person that he uses after this is someone whose name has stood the test of time, because he says that a man's choice between Miss Ruby M. Ayers and Tolstoy, right, who we all still know. He says this about it. He says, "We're quite on all fours with this choice between mild and bitter beer. We should not discuss it or not seriously," right? So if it was the same thing of just liking Tolstoy versus this random, contemporary romance author who didn't stand the test of time, if it was all just the same as liking a different taste in beer, we wouldn't ever be having this conversation, because people would say, well, whichever beer you like is fine. That is subjective, right? Yeah. And he's saying with this, it's not so much. In fact, he says, but in fact, we do not really think so. We may say so in the heat of an argument, but we don't really believe it. The idea that some preferences in art are really better than others cannot be got rid of, and this idea, brought into conflict with the fact that there seem to be no objective tests, engenders the problem. So it's the idea of good art versus bad art, and what it means to have taste in good art versus bad art. Now, as Lewis goes on, he's actually really clear about what he means by bad art. Did you find this interesting?
I did. Yeah, this is not an easy essay.
It's shorter than the other one, though.
It's shorter, but it's not easy. And one of the things that made it difficult is I don't understand some of the references.
Okay.
And Lewis is so skilled in how he's presenting things. At first, I'm not sure if he's saying it was good or bad.
Okay.
Which, I don't know, may have been the point. I kind of doubt it. I think more we're just reading it almost 100 years later.
Yeah, he says he wants to be very clear that what he means by bad, he's not talking about, for instance, the very first example he gives is the Ring Cycle by Wagner. And he says that the theory is not going to work with that. He says you must pitch your standard a good deal lower than that. And so I was honestly confused here, because I've never heard anyone say that Wagner's work is bad. Now, I'm not a huge fan of his work. Not because I think it's bad, but because opera is just not for me. And so, or at least I don't have the taste for it yet. I need to maybe develop that taste more. I've tried listening to opera before. It has not stuck with me. I will keep working on it.
Have you tried watching it? Like watching YouTube?
Never
clips?
tried, no.
It makes a big difference.
Okay.
There's so much more going on than just the singing part, and it's a lot easier to focus on the story.
Yeah.
I was surprised.
So I was wondering if what he's meaning when he says bad is maybe things that are now viewed as maybe in a more negative light. I mean, obviously, Wagner is very infamous for being very anti-Semitic. In fact, he was like a hero of Hitler's, I believe. And as you know, he looked to him as this kind of 19th century artist who had these kind of horrible beliefs. And so I wonder if Lewis is implying that. Again, this is not me authoritatively saying, this is me trying to just, okay, what does he mean by people thinking that, you know, Wagner's work would be bad? Because what he's saying is, no, you've got to think of things much worse than that. In fact, he says this when he talks about bad art. You must mean by bad art the things which are not even considered among people who discuss the question seriously at all. So he's saying these things on the radio, these things being circulated in the library, this kind of the hotel art, which is its own kind of, you know, we all know what that means when we say it's hotel art, right? All of these things, he's saying, that's what I mean by bad art. And he's saying that we shouldn't even really be thinking that seriously about this. And he actually never even says out loud in this essay that art is not subjective. The implication from Lewis is that we shouldn't even be saying that, because obviously art is not subjective. Now, what's hilarious is for you and I, living in 2024, the idea that art is subjective is one of the most fundamental beliefs of our culture and of our time period.
Take it from someone who went to art school.
Right?
And had to get grades.
I have spent a lot. Yeah, how does that work? All art is subjective. Here's your grade.
It is incredibly frustrating. You spend 3 hours talking about how everything is subjective and all these different points, and then you get a grade. And if it's too low, you might lose your scholarship. It's so bad.
I spend a good bit of time. We talked about this before. I like watching YouTube essays, like video essays. And there's a YouTuber that I actually like who does essays on art, and not just like paintings and sculpture, but does it on movies and television, kind of all of those things. Just kind of a jack of all trades, knows a lot about a lot of things. One of the things that this YouTuber always says that always gets under my skin, though, is before he tells you why a piece of art is really legitimately great. Now remember, all art is subjective. And it's like, it always bothers me because then he goes on to tell you why this thing is objectively good.
Yeah.
But it's almost one of those things that we just think because we've been told it over and over and over again. And Lewis doesn't even mention it because he's just would assume that you would believe, of course, art is not subjective. There is good art and there is bad art. And if you don't enjoy a good piece of art, it's your fault. Like me with the opera. If I don't like opera, if I listen to Wagner and I don't get it and I don't like it, then the problem is actually inside of me. It's not that the art is subjective and it isn't touching me the right way. It's like, oh, I must have a deficiency of some kind that I can't get into it. And I need to work on myself. I need to improve my own taste because I need to learn to love this thing, which many people love. And you can still have opinions about these things. We're not saying you can't have opinions, but he is saying that good art needs to be valued and that it's actually bad to have a taste for bad art.
Right. And he makes it very clear. He's not attacking the bad art. He's attacking the statement that stuff in the hotel rooms and the stuff being blasted on the radio is the same as the great art.
Exactly. This is what's so interesting. He says this about it as he goes on. He says, and I'll pause for a minute because the thing that I maybe don't understand or don't agree with Lewis is the next claim that he makes. And I wonder if this is something newer for us in the 21st century or kind of late 20th century that maybe would not have been true in the 50s or the 40s when he's writing this. He says, he says, the wireless is turned on, the novels circulate, and the poems are bought. So some people like these things, obviously. But here's what he says, but have we evidence that they fill in anyone's life the place that good art fills in the lives of those who love it? He goes on to say, look at the man who enjoys bad music. While he's enjoying it, he goes on to say, this guy's doing a bunch of other stuff. He's not fully engaged. He doesn't let it take over him. But he says, when it is over, or before it is over, he will be talking to you about something else. He'll have moved on. And then he says, I mean when the actual performance is over. When it is over, in quotation marks, in another sense, when the song or dance has gone out of fashion, he never thinks of it again, except perhaps as a curiosity. He's saying with this, you're never fully in love or fully overtaken by bad art. It can't overtake you in the same way. One other thing I'll say here before I want to get your thoughts. He says he or she may want her weekly ration of fiction very badly indeed and may be miserable if denied it, because he says that literature has a perfect example of the consumer of bad art. Here's what he says. But this is the consumer of bad art. He never rereads. There is no clear distinction between the literary and the unliterary. It is infallible. The literary man rereads, other men simply read. A novel once read is to them like yesterday's newspaper. I mean, that's a hot take.
It is. I agree with him, but it sounds like maybe you don't.
I don't disagree with him. I mean, you and I have talked, so this is why I thought this sounds just like us. We've talked so much about, his other line of, any book worth reading only once is not worth reading at all. This has been something that we have said over and over again. What I'm interested in all of this is, one, with the idea of rereading, I do think that you and I probably reread much less than Lewis does. There are books I reread. There are not that many books that I reread. There's probably only about 24 books, definitely under 30 of books that I reread throughout my life, or regularly, or maybe I've even read twice. Now, maybe like younger books or books I do for work. Obviously, I read a lot in my job, and so I'm not counting those. But I'm talking just at home on my own. There's not that many books that I reread. To be honest, again, probably about 24, 25 books, and a lot of them are by C.S. Lewis, right? But I think that is something that should convict me of like, yeah, you're right. There is just so much available to me. The amount of books I have available to me, even compared to Lewis, is insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I can download any book I want to on my Kindle, and it's there in 30 seconds or less.
Older books are just so cheap. You can buy it. You can buy so many things for $2 or $3 on, say, thrift books or something.
I wonder if I would say absolutely. It is a good distinction to make. The idea that it's infallible, I'm not so sure that holds up as much anymore, but I'm open to being wrong. The other thing, just to walk back one more, is when he talks about the fact that the people never really love it the same way. He says, but have we evidence that they fill in anyone's life, the bad art fills in anyone's life, the place that good art fills in the lives of those who love it. Now, Phil, this is going to sound off topic, but it's not. I just got back less than a week ago from Washington State, and we were up there, had a cousin get married outside of Seattle, and there's kind of a tale of two cities, literally, that I want to tell you about here. The first night we were there, the first few nights we were there.
Is this the best at times?
It was the best at times. It was a little bit of the worst at times because we traveled with two kids across the country, and one of my kids got sick, like violently puking. So that was the worst of times, but also it was a great family vacation outside of that, so best of times. We stayed in a small town, which I did not, that's where we got the Airbnb. It was near where the wedding was. Snoqualmie, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, Washington, which is about 45 minutes outside of Seattle. And while we were there, I go into a gift shop, and I find out that this is the town where Twin Peaks was filmed. Mm-hmm. Obviously the groundbreaking famous show from the 90s.
And just try to picture a ground baking show.
The ground baking
probably takes place.
It's got to be out there somewhere. Someone's making that show.
It takes place in Tonga, where they actually cook the food in the ground.
So it was so interesting. Obviously, Twin Peaks. They had that. I have not seen it. The new one that came out like 5 or 6 years ago. But they did even like a reboot that was like very like critically acclaimed. Obviously, it's a show that people still talk about to this day, despite the fact that it only has 2 seasons, and by many people thought to be a very well-made show. So we go there and we see all the cool things. People still come and visit. The show was filmed more than 30 years ago there. People still go and they get excited. They love this. I mean, people really love this show. Later on, we were on the other side of Seattle. A few days later, we were driving through Port Angeles, which is right there on the border of Canada and Washington on the Olympic Peninsula, driving around Olympic National Park, going to one of the Pacific Ocean beaches. And we passed through the town of Forks, Washington. Now, does that have any significance to you?
That's where the fork was invented.
That was where the fork was invented. So it had no significance to me. I did not know what it was. But as we get there, both my wife and my sister both let me know that they're like, wait a second. I know where we're going. Like, I know this place. And they're like, this is where Twilight takes place. It takes place in Forks. Well, now, I've never read the books. I've never seen them. I don't know anything about it. I know it's like vampires and werewolves, but I don't know any of the story. And it has Batman in it.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. I assume he plays a bat in it. It has to be, right? Oh, he probably actually, I think he does play a vampire. So, I can't talk. I'm so excited. All right. So we go through Forks, Washington. And we did stop, not in one of the gift shops, but they have the Twilight gift shops. Now, I am not here to disparage Twilight, but I do not believe that Twilight is held in the same high regard as other great literary fantasy series of the 20th and 21st century.
The books are about the same thickness. I will give them that.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. But Twilight gets, from what I understand, kind of thrown into like not great books. A lot of people read them. They're very popular. They're not really fantastic. And yet we go there, and this town had Twilight stuff everywhere. And there were, on the way back, we were passing through, there was a line of people there, again, that drove to this town that has like 3,000 people who live in it. And it's not the closest town is, an hour and a half away, and that town has like 20,000 people. So this beautiful drive, but this is a remote town. People who drive out because they love Twilight so much. And I think the Tale of Two Cities here is that I would say one of these is kind of critically acclaimed as a great work of art, and one of them is really not held in the best regard, and both of them have fans who absolutely love them. Mm. And I can think of many, many, many bad book series, bad movies, bad television shows that are very popular and not just, they're popular, but people are not fully invested in them. I'm talking people legitimately love them. And so where Lewis says that those people never really fully love them, like, I don't know, I see some pretty, wild fans of things that I would say kind of are objectively not the strongest works of literature. And I just, that fandom culture, though, is a relatively new thing.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by this just because I don't know that there were, what fandoms existed in the 50s?
Yeah.
It became a person's, that feels like a very post-internet, like post-1990s world.
I think it took the internet to connect the one or two people in each town who liked something enough to get together, and then fandom started to become cooler.
But
once you found each other.
There are people who have entire, I'm sure there's somebody out there. I'm using Twilight as an example just because I was just in the town. People who had, like, Twilight is their identity, right? And I think that if we were to probably look at Twilight, we would say, is it really worth your entire identity, your entire love? Whereas we would say people like us, who literally have made a lot of our personality around, not personality, but a lot of our work outside of our jobs and our families about C.S. Lewis, we would actually say we actually believe that his art is so good, it actually is worth devoting our time and energy and all of this effort, this identity in some ways, to it. But I think a lot of people do the same thing for art that I would say is not that good.
I think the only question there would be, if you take someone who really does enjoy Twilight that much, are they enjoying it? Are they thinking about it in a way that is, does the story stick with them, or is it more the world that is
the
built,
universe or something? Yeah,
is really fun for, like, I really enjoyed the Harry Potter books.
Sure,
but I think those are a little closer to. They had some incredible themes. I haven't read Twilight, so I can't really compare it. But
yeah, I've seen that episode of Parks and Rec that makes fun of Twilight. That's about the strength of my knowledge. Is that one episode in Parks and Rec?
I don't know if Harry Potter will qualify as great literature. I think it definitely falls into the more popular.
Sure.
I do think they're well written. I'm not disparaging any of this stuff, but I'm just saying I don't think it compares to some of the classics that have lasted hundreds of years. I'm curious if someone who is so into Twilight, they have all the stuff, they buy a lot of things with it, and they talk about it all the time. I'm curious how they would react to something really great that has stood the test of time.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people may not. I don't know if they've gotten there yet. And I would be curious to see what it's like, because I think you and I are just at the beginning of discovering the stuff that hits really, really deeply.
Yeah.
And it does feel different. But I feel like I've read less than 10 truly great works of literature. And the ones that I'm still in the middle of, like since our last discussion, The Republic by Plato.
Yep, I've heard of it.
Really difficult. I'm really struggling. But I can also tell that there's something really deep and meaningful behind it. And the thing that keeps me coming back is people have been talking about this book for a really, really long time, and they keep publishing it. And it's not just because it's out of copyright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think there's what you mentioned. There's something about good art, which again, Lewis never really fully defines here. He defines what, and even with his idea of bad art, he's like, here's kind of what it is, but he's not super, definitive about it. He more talks about how good art and bad art affect people or how they react to it, but he's never very open about his definition of it. It's kind of like he knows it when he sees it kind of thing. But with bad art, his argument is that it just doesn't move you in the same way. And I do wonder if what is moving people who get so involved and, fall in love with, what we're saying is not the best art, or what Lewis might say is bad art. Like, I'm sure there's Danielle Steele fan clubs out there, right? There's got to be. You mentioned John Grisham, or what's the other guy?
James Patterson.
Which one lives here in Virginia?
John Grisham. He's in Charlottesville.
He's in Charlottesville. Okay. So we got to be. We like him. He's fine.
Have you read B.J. Novak's The Something?
No.
By he pretends that John Grisham has a novel come out called The Something, and it was a placeholder title, and no one ever called him. And so John Grisham sees a big advertisement. Congratulations to John Grisham on the something. And he just loses it and he calls his agent and all this stuff.
Is it like a short story or something?
It is so good. My favorite line of all of BJ Novak's stuff is in it. He went out, he's holding a cup of coffee and he gets the newspaper. He was still a print guy. Print had been good to him. It's so nice. Oh man, it's so nice.
But with all those, this idea is that you're actually not being moved the way that you think you love this thing, but you actually don't love it. You're actually missing out on a greater, deeper love, is what Lewis is arguing here. And that's where I'm interested to continue unpacking this just with you, even outside of the podcast, in kind of a post-internet world where there is those big communities around things. But Lewis says this, which is so interesting. He talks a lot about that what bad art is. It's not about love. It's more about just a nice desire. He says, what the patrons of the bad art clearly desire, and they do get it, is a pleasant background to life, a something that will fill up odd moments, packing for the mental trunk or roughage for the mental stomach. There is really no question of joy, of an experience with a razor's edge which remakes the whole mind, which produces the holy spectral shiver, which can make a man feel really sick, just as I have been formerly been when I'm in love with my wife. He's a quote right there. He's not married at this point. The pleasure in bad art is not an occurrence in unfortunate context of the same pleasure men take in good art. So he's saying the desire for bad art is the desire bred of habit, much like a smoker's desire for tobacco. That's a lot there, but what he's saying is it's more of just like filling in the space. Mm-hmm. Nothing to me makes this more clear than the desire for content. We've talked about this.
It reminds me of the infinite scroll carousel type thing where, if you actually stop someone right before they load, say, Instagram, mm-hmm. is there anything you actually want to see? And then after you flip through, was there anything that really struck you?
Yeah.
Or was it just like the worst small dopamine hit because you saw another picture of someone's meal or cat or something?
Mm-hmm. This is something that I've tried to do in my own life, and it's been relatively successful, but only after years of doing it poorly, which is that I no longer will I turn on my television unless I know exactly what I'm about to do.
Yeah.
So I watch TV. I absolutely do. And I love watching some sports on TV. There's some TV shows that Ann and I like to watch together. There's a few shows that I'll watch. Actually, the shows I watch by myself are all Star Trek. But I will no longer. But it took years to get good at this. I will not turn on the TV unless I know exactly. We have the Roku, so I know exactly what app I'm going to. And it's because I don't want to just scroll and scroll. And at that point, what I realize is I'm not actually even looking to be entertained by one particular thing. I'm just looking for something to kind of, what does he say here? A pleasant background to life, something that will fill up odd moments. That's what I'm looking for there. And again, I'm not anti-TV. Anna and I enjoy watching television together. And I love watching sports. But even when it comes to something like sports, I actually try not to be like, I'm just going to turn it on and see what's on, which is what I used to always do all the time. And seeing what's on usually didn't work out that well. I would turn it off after 20 minutes and be like, I just flipped channels for 20 minutes, I just jumped through different apps if that's what you do now. But this is what he's talking about with bad art. And I think what's interesting in our context here is that when I'm actually going between all of those different apps, looking at different things on TV, a lot of actually what's offered to me is good. There's a lot of really quality TV and movies at my fingertips, and I will watch 10 minutes of each one of those and then call it a day.
Yeah.
This is something so different that he doesn't have because he's literally writing before television exists.
Right. Yeah, this is just interesting in our current time. He talks about the pleasure in bad art is not an occurrence in an unfortunate context of the same pleasure men take in good art. The desire for bad art is the desire bred of habit, like the smoker's desire for tobacco, more marked by the extreme malaise of denial than by a very strong delight. in fruition.
Oh, that's so good. It's more marked by the extreme malaise of denial, of not having it. And
this is exactly what I experienced. James Patterson doesn't care about me. But this is how I felt when I read James Patterson. It felt like it was kind of numb. And it felt like that was, I read 18 chapters in 5 minutes because they're so short.
Yeah.
But what did I really get out of it? And what was I thinking about 20 minutes later? Mm-hmm. And I feel this way whenever you go into a used bookstore and you see all the...
They gave them back because I read it once, right?
Right.
It's like Lewis says, they read it the one time. It's like reading the newspaper for today, and then you move on.
Yeah. If you read news from 3 weeks ago, it's really not that interesting.
That's why one of the things I've tried to do with my news, and again, this was an idea that I got from many other people, not from myself, is I've told you, this about me, is I mostly will only read news in magazines.
Yeah, now. Where it's published a week later, they've had some time to write it down.
And I'll read, like, I'll read The Atlantic, I'll read, like, The New Yorker, but I do have, like, the online access, so I can read them there, but I try to read a lot more of the stuff that comes out in the print magazine. So there's still news, but it's like we've actually sat on it for a month. We're not in the 24-hour cable or cable news cycle where it's like every single thing has to be the biggest story ever. And so it's more like, hey, a week later, what actually did matter? And again, it's only a week later. It's not a year later, a century later. It's like just a week later what actually mattered, because half of the stuff that is scrolling on, whether it's CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, whichever one you're watching, right? What they're telling me is the worst thing in the world will be forgotten 2 days from now.
Yeah.
And so I try to do that. What's interesting about this is that Lewis is making this interesting argument as this kind of first week's essay comes to an end, that what's happening here is that many people might think they still do love good art. He's kind of answering, love bad art. But he says, again, it's the wrong, we're using the wrong verb there. He's saying what we're really not understanding is that the people who love bad art they have such a, they're missing out on something so much greater that they don't realize what they're missing out on. Like, they might think that what they have for this bad art is love, but it's not, right? He says this, I suspect, therefore, that we must never say simply that some men like good art and some men like bad art. The error here lurks in the verb like. You might as well infer from the French uses of, I believe this is aimer, A-I-M-E-R, it means like love, that a man loves a woman as he loves golf, and start trying to compare these two loves in terms of better and worse taste. We have, in fact, been the victims of a pun. The proper statement is that some men like bad art, but that good art produces a response for which liking is the wrong word. And this other response has, perhaps, never been produced in anyone by bad art.
I feel like you've been the victim of a pun every episode of this show. That phrase really stood out to me when I was prepping for this.
That's so interesting. The same way that you say, oh, I love golf, or I love my wife, very different uses of that word. And we could all get into here, Lewis and the four loves. We won't do that today. But he's saying that idea of that response, there's a certain response that cannot be produced by bad art.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's move on, though, because there's less actually for us to really talk about in his second part of the essay, but I still want to spend just a little bit of time here. What happens in this second part of the essay that's published a week later?
Well, before we move on, this is really reminding me of I feel like maybe this is a conversation that I have in my head with people that I want to be having more out loud and in person with the actual person. But I feel like faith could be substituted for art here, in that there are people who they think that they have found everything they need and they are content with that. And what is frustrating for me as someone who feels that I think I have found something deeper and more meaningful in Christ. And it's hard to explain that to someone who thinks they have all the stuff they need or that they can do it on their own. And I'm not saying that they're not in a good place. They've made good decisions. They've set themselves up well. but there's something so much deeper and so much more powerful if you know the Lord. And this essay is really reminding me of that.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I like that.
Yeah, it makes me want to. Yeah, I want to lean into that more and see what else is there.
Yeah,
because maybe this conversation about art could lead to that conversation, but it's also hard because I don't think that life with Christ is necessarily easier or more financially viable or anything like that. I think I very quickly want to sell it as a life hack, but it's not. It actually might be more difficult.
Yeah.
But I think it's better.
But it's richer.
It's richer, and it's more meaningful.
And that is, the point that Lewis is making here. He even says that, interestingly enough here, that bad art can never enrapture, right? Bad art never enraptures. Again, there's this lack of richness to it. It never can completely overtake you in the best possible ways. Again, that idea is we don't want to, right? As moderns, we don't want something to take away. We want our we're Americans too. We want our freedom. We want our independence. Yeah. And he's saying the good art takes over us. It overcomes us. And so we don't really want to give up that independence. But that's what good art does to us. Again, the thing, though, that I struggle with here, and I'd love to hear from listeners, I would really, really love to hear from listeners, is I can think, though, of bad TV shows. I'm not just talking about inappropriate. I'm talking about shows that I'm like, this is really poorly made, and people know it's kind of not well made, and yet people seem to be enraptured by it. I guess what Lewis would maybe argue there is, well, they're not really enraptured. They might think they are, they might act like they are, but it's not actually working on them in the same way. I guess that's maybe what he's saying. I mean, I know he's not talking about TV here, but I can also think of books that are just not good and yet have these audiences that line up at midnight and they're obsessed and they can't get enough of it. Although, I mean, think about something like 50 Shades of Grey, the people who went nuts for those books, which obviously I've never read them. I've heard that not only obviously with them, not even their subject matter, but people say they're not well written. And yet people went insane for these books. And so how do we explain that seemingly? Is it just it's not actually being enraptured? It's just a kind of a shallow feeling? I'd love to hear what Lewis would have to say about that. It's weird to say. I want to know Lewis's take on 50 Shades of Grey. But maybe listeners' takes.
Maybe that'll be a dancing line.
Do you feel that tension at all?
ChatGPT assisted.
Yeah.
Do I feel what?
That tension of but I can think of bad art that seemingly does enrapture others.
Yeah. Well, we're living in a really interesting time. I watched a documentary with a friend about one of the worst movies ever made. I don't know if you saw. This was back when streaming didn't really have.
Like The Room?
It's very similar.
Okay.
It is that level of bad, but it's also that level of popular. Mm-hmm. This is back when streaming really didn't have very much on it. This is 2011. And it was just so awful, but people were talking about it because it was so lowly rated, and a lot of people had seen it. And they interviewed all these people, and there is this phenomenon of people watching bad movies and getting together and picking one out that is really bad and watching it. But
isn't that different because they know it's they're saying, hey, this isn't good. Like when I've watched The Room, I've watched it in big groups of people, and nobody actually thinks this. They're like, this is horrible art.
Right.
It's a terrible movie, and that's why it's so funny.
Yes. I do think it's different. And I think what we're actually really talking about here is mediocre art. And we did this. One of the most interesting things that we did freshman year in art school is really, it was difficult, but not for the reasons you might expect. I was actually hoping for more instruction, and it was more just talking about stuff. But one of the assignments they gave us was to make bad art. And the lesson at the end of it, I'll just skip to what the lesson was. It's actually really hard to make bad art. It's really easy to make mediocre art. And everybody ended up making mediocre stuff. But to make something really bad, I think the secret is actually that you have to put way more work into something that's not that great. And so Thomas Kincaid is kind of the ultimate example. Incredibly highly rendered.
Yeah. Is that a real guy? I thought it was just the name of a company.
Well, it's a guy.
It is a company now.
It's a guy who became a company. He is now deceased.
Oh, I didn't realize he was a real guy. I just thought the name of the company was Thomas Kincaid.
Yep.
But I mean, like in art school, you guys would say that that's like bad, right? Yes. But kitsch would probably be a good way of like.
It is the definition of kitsch.
Yeah. I feel like I only think of Thomas Kincaid as being on puzzles. You know what I mean? Like, I forget that like he was actually painting.
Yeah, and they would sell printed out canvas with his stuff on it, and then for a little bit extra, you could have one of his trained artists paint on top of it, and then for a lot extra, you could have him paint on top of it.
Interesting.
But it's not even original stuff. It's he does a painting and then has it printed out a million times.
Interesting. Well, let's go to something a little bit more in line with us, juvenile tastes. Something we can handle here. The final essay we'll just mention, and this is not one we're going to spend a lot of time with because it's really just saying things that we've been saying all season, that we've been saying Lewis has said all season long.
And the reason we didn't choose to focus on this one is we would be repeating a lot of the
there's not
stuff.
much that's new here. It's just the idea again that children's tastes or thinking about something as being of a child's taste is kind of a fallacy in and of itself. Here in this very, very short essay, Lewis talks about children's books and talks about kids kind of being regarded as what he says a distinct literary species, and that the production of books caters for their supposedly odd and alien taste, and that's become an industry. And in all of this, he's really saying kids don't have different tastes than adults do. They don't. And I think this is so right. He says, we actually find there's no literary taste common to all children. We find among them all the same types as ourselves. He's like, some kids like adventures. Some kids kind of like those school stories he's mentioned before that he's not very big fan of. He talks about how not only that, but we see adults, especially in the past, loved fantasy, loved things like the Odyssey. He says, you have Aesop, you have Arabian Nights, you have Gulliver, Robinson Crusoe, Treasure Island, Peter Rabbit, Wind in the Willows. All of these are liked by young audiences, and yet only 3 of those that he just mentioned were actually written for kids.
We also finally have confirmation that C.S. Lewis does not like the Arabian Nights.
He does not like, he says that. He also has this kind of great line about silly children and silly adults where he says, fantasies and marvels like the Odyssey or Spencer, Mervyn Peake, he said all of these books have been liked by grown-ups too. Fantasies and marvels have been liked by everybody. He's like, as well, some kids just like books of information. So do some adults. He said some children prefer success stories about school life, silly children prefer success stories about school life, just as silly adults like success stories about grown-up life. That's so great.
Burn.
I love that. The idea that those are those school stories he talks about, right? The ones that give you actually that are worse at preparing you for the actual world that is coming as you get older.
Yeah.
What else does he have to say here about these stories and children's tastes?
I love how he talks about still liking things. So this line, a few paragraphs later, even if all children and no adults now like the marvelous, and neither is the case, we ought not to say that the peculiarity of children lies in their liking it. The peculiarity is that they still like it, even in the 20th century.
Exactly, yeah. And then also, obviously, the 21st century, too. He makes a direct quote, or at least, no, he doesn't make a quote, but he talks about Tolkien's idea about that whole taking just like you take your worst furniture and you the old-fashioned furniture and you put it in the nursery. We've done the same thing with stories. And he says, even if all children and no adults now like the marvelous, like you just said, he's like, the peculiarity is that they still like it. It does not seem to me useful to say, what delighted the infancy of the species naturally still delights the infancy of the individual. Now, this is a great idea, because what he says is a lot of the disdain. This is an idea we haven't necessarily heard from Lewis before. But he says a lot of the disdain for, in his opinion, of these childish stories, the fairy stories, the marvelous stories, the mythic stories, he says that, we now view them here in the 20th and now 21st century as being childish. And we go, yeah, but yeah, the adults liked that back in the ancient medieval days, but that's when humanity was much more in its own infancy. And now we're more mature, and so we also need to be reading different kinds of books because now humanity is more mature and grown up. And this is interesting because Lewis says, well, what age is man? Is the race now in its childhood, its maturity, or its dotage? As we don't know at all exactly when it began and have no notion when it will end, this seems like a nonsense question, and who knows if it will ever be mature. Man may be killed in infancy. He's like, there is this sense, though, that, oh, well, as a species, we've evolved. This is a very, very progressive idea, right? The very idea of progressivism, right, from Lewis's perspective, is this, that humanity is getting better. We are growing. We are maturing. And Lewis is consistently saying, I'm not so sure that's the case.
Yeah. I love when a ridiculous question is pointed out like that. Mm-hmm. We don't know where we are.
He says, these, when good... he says, fashions and literary tastes come and go. And he says, these, when good, do not improve the taste of children, and when bad, they do not corrupt it, for children read only to enjoy. Of course, their limited vocabulary, he says, will make some books unintelligible, but apart from that, juvenile taste is simply human taste, going on from age to age, silly with a universal silliness, or wise with a universal wisdom, regardless of modes, movements, and literary revolutions. He says, yeah, it's just human taste. The idea that there is some kind of juvenile taste is really just false. But he does say that all of this has led to one very curious result. What does he have to say about all this? And again, this is so interesting because Lewis is saying this after having published Narnia.
He's saying that we've almost been divided into two different classes, with children as a distinct race.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're being served as those individual groups.
Yeah.
Which is, like you said, funny because his books are marketed toward children.
Yeah.
But they're also still being read by guys in their 30s.
Yeah.
Have a couple microphones.
As you mentioned, he says there's these two kind of distinct types of people now. People who write for children, some who treat children as a very distinct race. We saw a little bit of that on the 3 ways of writing for children when the woman made up that machine because that's just what the kids want these days. Yeah. And he said the right sort, though, they work from the common, universally human ground they share with the children and indeed with countless adults. They label their books simply for children because children are the only market now recognized for the books they, anyway, want to write. Which is really a sad way to end this.
Yeah.
Like, well, they're written for children just because no one else will publish it.
It's always interesting when an author talks about the way publishing works.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reason we've heard of people is because they were published.
Yeah.
And even still, now that you can self-publish, still the people that you've heard of are usually from one of the 5 big publishers, if you've heard of them. Now, they might be able to pivot and grow their own audience, but still the really big ones that we are able to talk about have been backed by a big publisher.
Sure.
And the author isn't necessarily in charge of where their books are put or how they're marketed, because that's left to somebody else. And I'm curious, how would it work? How would we find Narnia if it wasn't marketed toward children or something similar? Say something else came out brand new 2024.
It's tricky. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the game you have to play when you're publishing, right? But so, I mean, I do think it's just interesting the way that we respond to, or publishers respond to, what they think we want as readers. Oh, YA is really popular right now. Let's just put Harry Potter all over in YA, or let's make that section and build it out. And now people are writing more and more YA novels because it is so popular. Now,
the final battleground will, of course, be the Presbyterian Church, and trying to get them to stop calling anything post-college young adult, because it's confusing. It just doesn't add up.
Like in the church.
I was always going to the young adult Sunday school class. You can't read YA if you're 35. Does
your church have like a young adult ministry?
This is my parents' church.
Oh no, but okay, yeah.
The one that I currently go to does not have a young adult ministry.
Our parish,
just everybody is. young adult.
Our parish has a young adult ministry, but it's 20 to 40. And it's like, that's a big,
wide range.
That's a big range. And it's mostly, which is fine. We usually don't attend because it's mostly people in their 20s that are either single or don't have kids yet and stuff. And so a lot, which is fine. I think it's great that happens. But it's like, there's a big difference between a 20-year-old in college or a 22-year-old right out of college and a 39-year-old with a couple of kids that are, in school at this point. So the young adult, it's just, that's a weird, and then the books, it's just a weird thing.
Yeah, that's funny.
Well, any final thoughts here to wrap up on juvenile tastes?
I wonder if there's a way, set a reminder for 20 years from now. I wonder how much things will have changed because it seems like, I think the reason we have categories like we have at the bookstore is because it increases sales.
Oh, 100%. Yes.
And I'm curious what will happen in 20 years because certain things have not happened. We thought that we were going all digital and that bookstores were out.
Yeah, no. Barnes & Noble's opening new locations.
For the first time in over 15 years, Barnes & Noble is opening new locations. But we're also seeing books that don't sell very many copies. You have 360 million people in the United States, roughly. Mm-hmm. And then to have a really, really good selling book, 100,000 copies.
Oh, that's not a lot at all.
It's not a lot at all.
I had no idea. That's a good selling book.
A very, 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 very small percentage of books are going to sell 100,000 copies or more. And I'm curious where all those books are going. And I've actually seen them at Second and Charles. You can get 4 for $20.
I have the strongest love-hate relationship with that store.
Yeah, me too. Some of the prices I see, there was a lightsaber for sale, and it was behind the counter. I said, "How much is that?" And she goes over, she looks at it, and she comes back with the biggest eyes, and she goes, "That's $270." I'm $270. She's like, "Yeah, you can get a custom one for that. Like you can get a real lightsaber. For that.
I can build one like that.
Cut stuff.
That's crazy." Well, let's wrap up. You did the end credits for the last episode, so I will do these, and we'll be back soon. I'm hesitant to say it because we've changed so much, but we're going to be reading Tolkien's On Fairy Stories in the near future. I don't know if that's the next episode or the episode after that, but we're kind of winding down our time in Season 8, getting ready for George MacDonald and The Princess and the Goblin soon.
Unless Daniel decides to
switch it up. Can we do a different book? Well, this episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Ashlyn Washburn, Ander Trophy, and Becca Brown for supporting us at our top tiers. If you'd like to contact us, you can mail us at P.O. Box 25854, Richmond, Virginia 23232. Email us at hello@thelamppostlist. No, not the. Sorry. Email us at hello@. That's confusing to say it that way. hello@lamppostlistener.com or call us at 406-646-6733. You can also find links to past guests, reference books, and many other things at that website, lamppostlistener.com, not the lamppostlistener.com.
Do you think we could get 1-800-Narnia? We should just call it and see if
someone else already has it.
See if it picks up.
Wouldn't it have to be longer than that? Because you don't have to have 7?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Narnia 000.
What is Narnia? It's just a bunch of A's at the end.
Someone please call that number.
This is a great way to bookend this because I earlier talked about our trip to Washington. We were at an Airbnb that had like a little code on the door to get in. This normal thing. A lot of houses have this, but the code had multiple numbers on each one, so that the code was just one button and then 3 of the same buttons in a row, which made me feel way less safe. Because I was like, I was a little afraid there was going to be just 4 straight in a row. Like it's technically 1 2 1 2, but really just push the same thing 4 times or something. Didn't like that.
Also, just a little PSA: if your code to your phone is your birthday, just go ahead and change that right now.
What? But what if you don't know? You don't know my birthday. What is it? Would you better get in my phone right now?
We could have a conversation. You could be having a conversation with someone. They could find out your birthday, and then your age can only be so many things. So if you add the 9-1 at the end.
That's true. Yeah.
Also, it's October 2nd, 1991.
That is true. I will tell you that my luggage, again, speaking of traveling, my luggage have like the TSA locks. You know, they put the little key in, but they have little locks on them. My luggage is 000. I've never changed any of them. All the luggage for our family is just 000.
So the TSA was trying to, for some reason, increase their social media following. And
wow.
They uploaded a picture of the keys that can unlock everything.
That's a terrible idea.
It's a really bad idea, especially when you have 3D printers. Everybody just took that picture and then printed out copies and opened up all the locks.
I always enjoy it because there's that one scene in Spaceballs where President Spaceball, is that his name? I don't know what his name is. The one that you never
haven't
seen
Spaceballs?
Wait, for real? You've never seen it?
I haven't. I'm just now working my way through Mel Brooks films. So give me a second.
We watched Spaceballs in the 7th grade English class, and I do not know why. I think our teacher just liked it. Was like, you guys should watch this.
This is why you're all about private school now.
This is true. I saw my first Mel Brooks movie, 7th grade English class in school, and my first Monty Python, the Holy Grail, freshman year, high school history class. Both of those movies.
I do think Mel Brooks and Monty Python should be seen in 7th grade at a all-night birthday party, and then you should play Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3
That is
4
true. Those are good ones for the
on the GameCube. That's the only way to do it.
Get the PlayStation 2 at least. Come on, man.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying what's
the
going to
kid
happen.
had. Yeah. All right. Well, thank everybody for coming along on this very weird journey sometimes. We will be back next time. But until then, further up and further in.
See you soon.